On the morning of November 5, 1943, Commander Yasuyoshi Nakamura stood in the intelligence section of the Naval General Staff building in Tokyo, staring at a reconnaissance photograph that refused to make sense. The photograph had been taken 3 days earlier by a patrol aircraft operating near the Marshall Islands. It showed an American carrier task force. Nakamura counted the carriers in the photograph, 11. 11 carriers operating together in a single task force. The number violated every calculation, every estimate, every projection that Japanese naval intelligence had produced over the past 2 years. According to the most recent intelligence assessments sitting on his desk, the United States Navy should have had approximately 11 operational carriers in the entire Pacific theater, not 11 in one task force, 11 total. Nakamura had spent the morning double-checking the identification. The silhouettes were unmistakable. Essex-class fleet carriers, not converted merchant ships, not light carriers hastily built on Shruza hulls, purpose-built, full-sized fleet carriers designed for sustained offensive operations, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one capable of launching strikes that could devastate an entire island base. If the Americans truly had 11 fleet carriers in this one task force, how many more did they have operating elsewhere? How many were still working up in Pearl Harbor? How many were under construction in American shipyards? The questions led to a conclusion that Nakamura did not want to face. Every number that Japanese naval intelligence had used to plan the war, every estimate of American carrier strength, every projection of how long it would take the United States to build replacement vessels, all of it was wrong. Catastrophically, decisively, irreversibly wrong. And by the time this photograph reached the desk officers in Tokyo who needed to see it, it was already too late to change the strategic assumptions that governed Japanese naval operations. The war had been planned around intelligence estimates that bore no resemblance to the reality unfolding in the Pacific. This wasn't a miscalculation that could be adjusted. This was a fundamental failure to understand the enemy Japan was fighting. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how Japanese intelligence failed to accurately assess American carrier production began not in 1943, when the truth became undeniable, but in 1941, before the war started, when Japanese naval planners were preparing for a conflict they believed they could win. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with the most powerful carrier force in the world. 6 fleet carriers, all modern, all battle-tested, carrying the finest naval aviators anyone had ever trained. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These ships represented 2 decades of Japanese carrier development. They were the product of careful naval architecture, extensive operational experience, and a doctrine refined through years of combat in China. The 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, were not just superior to anything the Americans possessed at that moment. They represented a level of carrier aviation competence that no other navy in the world could match. Japanese carrier pilots had trained for years. Japanese carrier operations were sophisticated. Japanese carrier tactics were proven in combat. The Americans, by contrast, had 4 fleet carriers in the Pacific when the war began: Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise, and Yorktown, all older designs, all operating with less experienced aircrews, all part of a navy that had never fought a carrier battle and had only theoretical understanding of how carrier aviation actually worked in combat. On paper, the Japanese advantage seemed decisive. 6 carriers to 4, with every quality metric favoring Japan. Better pilots, better doctrine, better operational experience, better everything. Japanese naval intelligence looked at this situation and made what seemed like reasonable projections about how the war would develop. They estimated that it would take the United States approximately 2 years to build a replacement for each carrier lost in combat. This estimate was based on careful study of American shipbuilding practices. The Americans had completed Yorktown in 1937 after 3 years of construction. They had completed Enterprise in 1938 after 3.5 years of construction. The numbers suggested a construction timeline that made sense. Fleet carriers were complex vessels. They required specialized shipyards, skilled workers, sophisticated machinery. Building them took time, lots of time. The Japanese assumed that American carrier construction would follow the pattern established in peacetime. Careful work, high-quality standards, slow, methodical progress that produced excellent ships, but required years from keel laying to commissioning. This assumption was reinforced by Japanese understanding of their own carrier construction processes. When Japan built a fleet carrier, it took 3 to 4 years from start to finish. Japan had the most experienced carrier builders in the world. If it took Japan 4 years to build a carrier, surely it would take America at least that long. Probably longer. The Americans lacked Japan's experience. They lacked Japan's specialized knowledge. They lacked Japan's 2 decades of carrier operations to inform their construction standards. Everything about American naval culture suggested that they would approach carrier construction the same way they approached battleship construction. Carefully, methodically, slowly. A carrier every 2 or 3 years from each major shipyard, assuming the Americans didn't lose focus and redirect resources to other priorities. This timeline supported Japanese strategic planning perfectly. If the war went as expected, Japan would secure the resource areas of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and then force the Americans to accept a negotiated settlement before American industrial capacity could overwhelm Japanese conquests. The timeline worked because American carriers couldn't arrive fast enough to matter. Lose 4 Japanese carriers at Midway in June 1942. Tragic, but manageable. The Americans would need 8 years to build 4 replacement carriers at 2 years per ship. Japan would have time to build replacements of its own, time to train new pilots, time to fortify defensive positions, time to wear down American will to continue fighting. Except the timeline was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not off by a few months or a year. Fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. The first indication that something was deeply mistaken came in December 1942, just 1 year after Pearl Harbor. American intelligence intercepts revealed that the United States Navy had commissioned a new fleet carrier named Essex. Japanese naval intelligence received the report and noted it carefully. 1 new American carrier. That was actually faster than expected. Perhaps the Americans had accelerated construction in response to early war losses. Essex had been laid down in April 1941 before the war started. She was commissioned in December 1942, 20 months from keel to commissioning. That was significantly faster than pre-war American construction timelines had suggested, but it wasn't impossible. Perhaps the Americans had streamlined their processes. Perhaps this one ship represented a special effort that wouldn't be sustainable across multiple shipyards. The intelligence officers in Tokyo noted the faster construction time, adjusted their estimates slightly, and continued planning on the assumption that American carrier production would follow recognizable patterns. 1 carrier every 18 months or so from major shipyards. Difficult to sustain, probably not repeatable across multiple facilities simultaneously. The strategic situation remained manageable. Then, in January 1943, reports arrived that the Americans had commissioned another fleet carrier. Yorktown CV-10, 2 fleet carriers in 2 months. That was concerning, but not yet impossible to explain. Perhaps both ships had been nearly complete when the war started. Perhaps they represented the culmination of pre-war building programs, not the beginning of a sustained production surge. Japanese intelligence analysts looked at the reports and searched for reasonable explanations. The Americans might have accelerated work on ships already under construction. That would explain the rapid appearance of 2 carriers, but it didn't necessarily mean they could sustain that pace. Shipyards had limits. Workers needed training. Materials required time to acquire. Surely the Americans would slow down once these initial ships were finished. In February 1943, Lexington CV-16 was commissioned, 3 fleet carriers in 3 months. That pattern couldn't be explained by pre-war construction programs. The Americans were building new carriers at a pace that didn't match any historical precedent. Japanese intelligence officers in Tokyo started pulling files, reviewing estimates, checking calculations. Something was wrong with their understanding of American shipbuilding capacity. But what? The Americans had never built carriers this fast before. Where were the ships coming from? More importantly, how many more were in the pipeline? In May 1943, Bunker Hill joined the fleet. In August, Intrepid. In November, both Wasp and Hornet, 6 fleet carriers commissioned in 11 months. Japan hadn't commissioned 6 carriers in the entire war. Japan had commissioned 1. Taiho, 1 carrier in 3 years of war. The Americans were producing carriers at 6 times the rate that Japan could manage. And they weren't building converted merchant ships or light carriers on cruiser hulls. These were full-sized, purpose-built fleet carriers, each one displacing 27,000 tons, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one capable of sustained combat operations across the Pacific. The implications were staggering and undeniable. Every estimate of American industrial capacity that had informed Japanese strategic planning was wrong. Every calculation about how long Japan could hold defensive positions was wrong. Every assumption about American inability to project force across the Pacific was wrong. Commander Nakamura pulled the intelligence files from early 1941 and started reading through pre-war estimates of American naval capacity. The projections were there in black and white. The United States Navy would need 2 years to replace each carrier lost. American shipbuilding capacity was limited by available shipyards, skilled workers, and construction timelines that couldn't be significantly compressed without sacrificing quality. The Americans would build good carriers eventually, but they couldn't build them fast. The estimates looked reasonable when they were written. Careful analysis, sound methodology, historical precedent to support every conclusion. They were also completely wrong. By November 1943, when Nakamura stood in the intelligence section staring at reconnaissance photographs of 11 American carriers operating together, the scope of the intelligence failure was becoming impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just that the estimates had been wrong. The real problem was that Japanese intelligence had failed to recognize the error, even as evidence accumulated month after month that something fundamental had changed about American shipbuilding. The first Essex-class carrier was commissioned in December 1942. If Japanese intelligence had recognized immediately that this represented a revolution in carrier construction timelines, they might have adjusted estimates in time to influence strategic planning. But they didn't recognize it. They saw it as an anomaly, an outlier, a special case. When the second carrier arrived in January 1943, Japanese intelligence still explained it away. 2 carriers in 2 months was unusual but not impossible to rationalize. Pre-war construction programs, special efforts, temporary acceleration that couldn't be sustained. When the third carrier arrived in February, the 4th in May, the 5th in August, and the 6th and 7th in November, it became impossible to rationalize. This wasn't a special effort. This wasn't temporary acceleration. This was systematic mass production of fleet carriers at scales that no one in Japanese naval intelligence had thought possible. The question that haunted Nakamura was simple. How did they do it? Japan had the most experienced carrier builders in the world. Japan had been building carriers since 1922. Japan understood carrier construction better than any other navy. If Japan needed 3 to 4 years to build a fleet carrier, how were the Americans completing carriers in 18 months? What had changed? What had the Americans discovered that allowed them to compress construction timelines so dramatically? The answer, when it finally became clear, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the kind of war Japan was fighting. Japanese intelligence had assumed that carrier construction was like carrier construction had always been. Specialized shipyards, skilled craftsmen, careful work that took years to complete properly. The Americans had broken every rule. They had industrialized carrier construction. They had applied mass production techniques developed for automobiles and cargo ships to fleet carrier building. They had prefabricated components in factories far from shipyards. They had standardized every possible element so that workers needed minimal training to complete specialized tasks. They had thrown out decades of accumulated wisdom about how ships should be built and replaced it with factory methods focused on speed rather than craftsmanship. And it worked. American shipyards were completing Essex-class carriers in 14 to 16 months from keel laying to commissioning. Not 2 years, not 3 years, 14 months. Japanese shipyard workers were craftsmen who took pride in custom-fitting every piece. American shipyard workers were factory laborers who bolted together prefabricated sections according to standardized blueprints. Japanese carrier construction emphasized quality and precision. American carrier construction emphasized speed and volume. Both approaches produced functional carriers. But only one approach could produce functional carriers fast enough to overwhelm the enemy through sheer numerical superiority. By November 1943, the truth was undeniable. The United States had more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. And more were coming, many more. The intelligence report that landed on Nakamura's desk in December 1943 contained numbers that seemed like errors. The report had been compiled by analysts working with signals intelligence, prisoner interrogations, and reconnaissance data from across the Pacific. It attempted to provide a comprehensive assessment of American carrier strength as of the end of 1943. According to the report, the United States Navy now possessed 14 operational fleet carriers in the Pacific theater. 14. Not the 6 or 7 that Japanese planners had expected, not the 8 or 9 that optimistic revisions had projected. 14 full-sized fleet carriers, each one capable of launching strikes with 90 aircraft. The report included a detailed breakdown. 7 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned and were already operating in the Pacific. Essex herself, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Intrepid Wasp, and Hornet, all commissioned in 1943. 7 carriers in 1 year from a single class design. The Americans had also commissioned 9 Independence-class light carriers in 1943. These were Cleveland-class cruisers that had been converted to light carrier configurations while still under construction. They were smaller than the Essex-class ships, carrying only 30 to 35 aircraft each, but they were fast, modern, and operational. 7 fleet carriers plus 9 light carriers. 16 new carriers commissioned in a single year. Japan had commissioned 3 carriers during the entire war, 1 fleet carrier, Taiho, and 2 light carriers converted from other hulls. The ratio was staggering. For every carrier Japan built, the Americans were building more than 5, and the American advantage was accelerating, not diminishing. Nakamura read through the intelligence estimates for 1944. The analysts projected that the Americans would commission another 7 to 9 Essex-class carriers during the coming year. They would have more than 20 fleet carriers operational by the end of 1944. 20 American fleet carriers against Japan's surviving force of 6. The numerical advantage would be so overwhelming that tactical skill, better trained pilots, and superior doctrine wouldn't matter. The Americans could lose half their carriers in combat and still outnumber Japan 2 to 1. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real crisis wasn't just that the Americans had more carriers. It was that they could sustain losses while Japan could not. When Japan lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midways in June 1942, those 4 carriers represented years of irreplaceable construction capacity. 4 carriers sunk in 1 day. 17 years of combined construction time, destroyed in a single battle. When the Americans lost Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, the losses were replaced within months. The new Lexington was commissioned in February 1943. The new Yorktown was commissioned in April 1943. Ships with the same names, carrying the memory of the vessels lost, but also demonstrating that American losses were temporary setbacks rather than permanent defeats. The strategic implications were absolute and immutable. Japan could not win a war of attrition against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Every carrier battle Japan fought would diminish Japanese strength permanently while only temporarily reducing American strength. Admiral Minechi Koga, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Admiral Yamamoto's death in April 1943, understood the mathematics perfectly. In a staff meeting in January 1944, Or he spoke with unusual candor about the situation facing the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans were coming with overwhelming force. They had the carriers, they had the aircraft, they had the pilots. Most critically, they had the industrial capacity to sustain offensive operations indefinitely, while Japan's capacity to resist diminished daily. Koga outlined what he called the Z Plan. It was a defensive strategy built around the recognition that Japan could no longer conduct offensive operations against American carrier forces with any reasonable expectation of success. Instead, Japan would wait for the Americans to attack Japanese defensive positions and then concentrate the remaining Japanese carrier force to fight a decisive battle on ground of Japan's choosing. The plan assumed that the Americans would eventually overextend their supply lines, that weather and logistics would constrain their operations, and that one decisive victory might inflict enough losses to force the Americans to negotiate rather than continue prosecuting the war to its inevitable conclusion. It was a plan born of desperation rather than confidence. But it was the only plan available to a navy that had lost the initiative and lacked the industrial capacity to regain it. The Z Plan would be tested in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It would fail completely, and in failing, it would demonstrate exactly how wide the gap had grown between Japanese capabilities and American strength. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On June 19th, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed 9 carriers to battle against American forces operating near the Mariana Islands. 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 6 light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda, Junyo, Hio, Ryuho, and the newly commissioned Onryu. 9 carriers represented nearly the entire operational strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Every carrier that could put to sea, every air group that could be assembled, every pilot that had completed training, all committed to one decisive battle that was supposed to cripple American offensive capability. The Japanese force departed from Tawi-Tawi anchorage in the Philippines on June 13th. Intelligence reports indicated that American carrier forces were supporting the invasion of Saipan in the Marianas. This was the opportunity the Z Plan had anticipated. American carriers operating near Japanese land-based air power, potentially vulnerable to coordinated attacks from carriers and shore-based aircraft. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese carrier force. He was an experienced officer who understood carrier operations thoroughly. He knew his force was outnumbered, but he believed that coordination with land-based aircraft and the superior range of Japanese carrier aircraft would offset the numerical disadvantage. Japanese carrier aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, had longer range than their American counterparts. Japanese strike aircraft could launch from positions beyond the range of American carrier aircraft, hit the American task force, and return safely, while American strikes would have to close to shorter ranges to launch their attacks. The plan was sound in theory. Superior range, creating a tactical advantage that multiplied the effectiveness of fewer aircraft. But the plan required 2 critical elements. First, accurate intelligence about American carrier positions. Second, land-based aircraft operating from Guam and other Marianas Islands to divide American attention and thin their defensive fighter coverage. Both requirements collapsed on contact with reality. American carrier forces operating near Saipan were commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, consisted of 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Wasp, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, and Essex, 8 light carriers operating in support roles, 15 carriers to Japan's 9. But the raw numbers understated the true disparity. American carriers embarked 956 aircraft. Japanese carriers embarked 450 aircraft, less than half the American total. Japan simply didn't have enough aircraft to fully equip its carriers. Production couldn't keep pace with losses. Pilot training couldn't produce enough qualified aviators to form full air groups. More critically, the quality gap had widened dramatically since the early battles of 1942. American pilots in Task Force 58 averaged 200 hours of combat flight time. Many had 300 hours or more. They had fought at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk, Hollandia. They knew their aircraft intimately. They knew how to exploit the Grumman F-6F Hellcat's advantages in speed, diving capability, and armor protection. Japanese pilots averaged 20 hours of combat flight time. Some had none. They were flying their first carrier operation against the most experienced naval aviation force ever assembled. Japan's pre-war training program had produced pilots after 2 years of instruction. By mid-1944, pilots were graduating after 6 months of abbreviated training with 100 flight hours instead of 500. The reason was simple and unavoidable. Japan lacked the fuel to conduct extended training flights. American submarines had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Oil from the Dutch East Indies wasn't reaching Japan in sufficient quantities. Aviation fuel was rationed. Training programs were compressed. Pilots learned to fly and shoot, but they lacked the experience to survive against veterans. The battle began at 7:30 in the morning on June 19th when Japanese search aircraft located American carrier forces. Ozawa launched his first strike wave at 7:30. 69 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The strike departed from positions approximately 300 miles west of the American task force. American radar detected the incoming strike at 150 miles. Fighter directors aboard American carriers vectored 40 Hellcats to intercept positions 40 miles from the task force. The interception began at 8:20 in the morning. What happened next became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the most one-sided air combat engagement of the Pacific War. American Hellcats hit the Japanese formation in waves. The first wave shot down 42 aircraft in the initial 10 minutes of combat. The surviving Japanese aircraft continued toward the carriers and encountered a second wave of American fighters, then a third wave, then massed anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers and cruisers. 8 aircraft from the original 69 broke through to attack range. They scored no hits. 4 aircraft returned to their carriers. The first Japanese strike lost 94% of its aircraft before reaching their targets. Ozawa launched a second strike at 8:56 in the morning. 109 aircraft. They met the same layered defense. American fighters destroyed 97 of them before they reached attack range. The few that broke through were driven off by anti-aircraft fire. A third strike of 107 aircraft achieved a single bomb hit on the battleship South Dakota, causing minor damage that didn't affect the ship's combat capability. A fourth strike became disoriented and scattered. Some aircraft found American carriers but were driven off. Others never located the enemy and returned to their carriers with bombs still attached, having accomplished nothing. Of 450 aircraft launched, 300 were shot down. Another 50 crashed, attempting to land on carriers in darkness after the battle. Japan lost 350 aircraft and their pilots in 1 day of combat. The Americans lost 29 aircraft. The exchange ratio was 12-1 in America's favor. It demonstrated the cumulative advantages of superior aircraft, superior pilots, superior doctrine, and superior radar direction. But the carrier losses told an even more devastating story. Taiho, Japan's newest and most modern fleet carrier, was hit by a single torpedo from the American submarine Kavala at 8:20 in the morning. The torpedo struck the carrier's starboard side forward. The damage should have been manageable. Japanese damage control doctrine was adequate for single torpedo hits, but a young damage control officer made a catastrophic error. He ordered the ship's ventilation system activated to clear gasoline fumes from the hangar deck. The ventilation system spread the fumes throughout the ship instead of venting them overboard. 6 hours after the torpedo hit at 2:30 in the afternoon, a spark ignited the gasoline vapor. The explosion tore Taiho apart. She sank in minutes, taking 1,272 men with her, 32 months to build, 3 months in operational service. Gone. The newest carrier in the Japanese fleet, destroyed by a single torpedo that wouldn't have sunk her if damage control had been executed properly. Shokaku, one of Japan's most successful carriers, and a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, was hit by 4 torpedoes from the submarine Kavala later that afternoon. She sank 7 hours later. Hio was hit by aerial torpedoes and bombs from American carrier aircraft. She caught fire, lost power, and sank. Japan lost 3 carriers in 1 day. The Americans lost none. Task Force 58 operated continuously throughout the battle. American carriers launched and recovered aircraft in coordinated cycles. When one carrier was recovering aircraft, others provided combat air patrol. When strikes were being launched, fighter cover remained overhead. The operations were so well coordinated that Japanese aircraft never penetrated American defensive screens in sufficient numbers to threaten the carriers themselves. This wasn't luck. This was the result of radar direction, superior training, overwhelming numbers, and operational experience accumulated over 2 years of continuous combat operations. By the evening of June 19th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was effectively over. Ozawa's carrier force was broken. 3 carriers sunk. Air groups decimated. Only 40 aircraft remained operational out of 450 launched that morning. The Americans continued pursuit on June 20th, launching long-range strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. American aircraft sank 2 oilers and damaged several other ships, though no additional carriers were lost. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the end of carrier aviation as an effective combat force. Japan still had carriers, but Japan no longer had enough aircraft or pilots to operate those carriers effectively in combat. The battle demonstrated what happened when overwhelming industrial capacity translated into overwhelming combat power. The Americans deployed 15 main carriers, not because they had gotten lucky or because they had fought brilliantly in earlier battles, but because American shipyards had built those carriers in assembly line fashion over the previous 18 months. Commander Nakamura received the battle reports in Tokyo 3 days after the fighting ended. He read through the casualty figures with something close to numbness. 3 carriers lost, 350 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,000 personnel killed or missing. American losses, 29 aircraft, 0 carriers. The disparity wasn't even close to sustainable. At this exchange rate, Japan would run out of carriers, aircraft, and pilots while the Americans continued expanding their force with new ships arriving from shipyards every month. Nakamura pulled the intelligence estimates from November 1943 and compared them to current assessments. In 7 months, the Americans had added 4 more Essex-class carriers to the Pacific Fleet. Ticonderoga, commissioned in May, Randolph in October, 4 more carriers beyond the 7 that had been operating in November. The projection for the remainder of 1944 suggested another 6 to 8 carriers would join the fleet before the year ended. By December 1944, the Americans would have more than 25 fleet carriers operational. Japan would have 6, assuming no additional losses in combat. Part 2 continues. Approximately 4,200 words total so far. Should I continue with the final section? This will cover the aftermath through 1945, the final carrier counts, and the devastating conclusion. Retime Final Part 3, Final Section. The strategic reality facing Japan by late 1944 was simple and absolute. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Japan still possessed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. But without carriers to provide air cover, those ships could not operate in any area where American carrier aircraft could reach them. And by October 1944, American carrier aircraft could reach nearly every body of water in the Western Pacific. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated just how completely Japanese carrier power had collapsed. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, who had succeeded Admiral Koga as commander of the combined fleet, devised a complex operation to defeat the American invasion of the Philippines. The plan called for Japanese surface forces to attack American amphibious shipping in Leyte Gulf, while Japanese carriers served as a decoy force to draw American carriers away from the main battle area. Japan committed 4 carriers to the decoy operation. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, 3 light carriers. These 4 ships embarked a total of 108 aircraft, not 108 aircraft per carrier, 108 aircraft total across all 4 carriers. Japan simply didn't have aircraft to equip its carriers. Production had fallen behind combat losses. Pilot training couldn't produce enough qualified aviators. Fuel shortages prevented the few pilots available from maintaining combat proficiency. The carriers sailed north from Japan, carrying skeleton air groups that represented a fraction of their design capacity. The decoy plan worked. American carrier forces under Admiral William Halsey detected the Japanese carrier force on October the 24th and pursued it aggressively. Halsey took every available carrier north, leaving Leyte Gulf protected only by escort carriers and surface ships. On October the 25th, American carrier aircraft found the Japanese carrier force and attacked throughout the day. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Zuikaku went down in the afternoon, the last of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. She had survived Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea. She was sunk because Japan no longer had enough aircraft or pilots to defend her. The sacrifice achieved nothing strategically. American escort carriers in Leyte Gulf fought off Japanese surface forces in a desperate series of engagements that left both sides battered, but allowed American amphibious operations to continue unimpeded. The loss of 4 carriers, including Japan's last Pearl Harbor veteran, brought nothing except a few hours of confusion in American command structures. By November 1944, Japan had no operational fleet carriers remaining. The combined fleet listed several carriers on paper, but none were capable of conducting sustained combat operations. Amagi and Katsuragi from the Onryu class were completing construction, but there were no aircraft to embark and no pilots to fly them, even if aircraft had been available. The United States Navy, in November 1944, operated 28 fleet carriers in the Pacific, 28 Essex-class ships, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one supported by supply ships that could keep them at sea indefinitely, each one manned by crews who had trained for months before deployment and who could be rotated home and replaced without degrading operational capability. Task Force 38, the designation for the fast carrier task force under 3rd Fleet Command, routinely operated with 17 to 18 carriers simultaneously. That single American task force deployed more carriers than Japan had possessed in its entire navy at the height of Japanese power in December 1941. The final accounting was brutal in its mathematical certainty. From December 7th, 1941 through August 15th, 1945, Japan commissioned 6 fleet carriers during the war. Taiho, commissioned in March 1944, sunk 3 months later at the Philippine Sea. Onryu, commissioned in August 1944, torpedoed by the submarine USS Redfish in December 1944 while transiting the East China Sea. Amagi, commissioned in August 1944, bombed at Kure by American carrier aircraft in July 1945. Katsuragi, commissioned in October 1944, bombed at Kure and survived, but never operated as a combat vessel. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, commissioned in November 1944, torpedoed by the submarine USS Archerfish, devastated 10 days after commissioning. Ibuki, a cruiser conversion, never completed. 6 fleet carriers commissioned in 3.5 years of war. 5 were sunk before the war ended. The 6th survived only because she was damaged so badly she couldn't put to sea. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers during the war. Essex herself in December 1942, Yorktown, Lexington, and Bunker Hill in the first half of 1943, Intrepid, Hornet, and Wasp in the second half of 1943, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, and Hancock in 1944, Bennington, Boxer, Bon Homme, Richard, Leyte, and Antietam in 1945 before the war ended. Kearsarge, Lake Champlain, Princeton, Tarawa, Valley Forge, Philippine Sea, and Princeton were completed after the war ended, but had been under construction during the fighting. 17 Essex-class carriers commissioned while the war was ongoing. Another 7 completed shortly after. 24 total, from a class that had been designed beginning in 1939 and first ordered in 1940. The title of this story says the Americans built 17 carriers and stopped counting. That's not literally accurate. The Navy counted every ship meticulously, but the numbers became so large that individual carriers stopped mattering strategically. Losing a carrier in combat was tactically unfortunate, but strategically irrelevant because another carrier would arrive next month to replace it. When Japan lost a carrier, it was a national crisis. Memorial services were held, prayers were offered, recriminations fell on naval commanders who had failed to protect irreplaceable assets. Each Japanese carrier represented years of construction time, massive resource expenditures, and capabilities that could never be recovered. When the Americans lost a carrier, it was mourned by the crews who served aboard and the families who lost loved ones. But strategically, it barely registered. USS Princeton was sunk at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, hit by a single bomb that detonated the torpedo magazine. The loss was tragic for the men who died. Strategically, it changed nothing because Task Force 38 continued operating with 17 other carriers and 2 more Essex-class ships were about to join the fleet. The emotional and strategic response to carrier losses revealed everything about the industrial gap between the two nations. For Japan, carriers were precious and irreplaceable. For America, carriers were important, but replaceable components in a vast industrial system that produced them faster than combat could destroy them. With this difference, more than any battle, more than any admiral's tactical genius, more than any technological innovation, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Industrial capacity won. Not courage, not sacrifice, not warrior spirit, not tactical brilliance, steel, welding torches, factory workers, and assembly line production methods. By July 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final phase. American carrier task forces operated off the Japanese coast with complete impunity. Task Force 38 under Admiral John McCain and Task Force 58 under Admiral Halsey included 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers in combined operations, 23 carriers launching more than 1,500 aircraft against targets throughout Japan. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. Japanese fighters were outnumbered 50 to 1 or more. American carrier aircraft struck airfields, factories, ports, naval bases, and the remnants of the combined fleet anchored at Kure Naval Arsenal. In a series of raids in late July, American carrier aircraft sank or severely damaged every significant Japanese warship still afloat. The battleships Hyuga, Ace, and Haruna, the carriers Amagi and Katsuragi, the cruisers Tone, Ioba, and Oyodo, everything still capable of putting to sea, was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Japan had no capacity to resist. The carriers that were supposed to be the decisive weapon in Japan's defensive strategy didn't exist anymore. The aircraft that were supposed to defend the home islands had been shot down. The pilots, who were supposed to inflict unacceptable losses on American invasion forces, were dead or so poorly trained they couldn't effectively engage veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. The war ended on August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered not primarily because of the atomic bombs, though those provided a face-saving excuse for the military leadership. Japan surrendered because the nation had no military capacity remaining to resist invasion. Carrier aviation had destroyed that capacity systematically over 3 years of combat. Commander Nakamura survived the war. He was in Tokyo on August 15th when the Emperor's broadcast announced the surrender. He had spent 3.5 years watching intelligence reports that documented the steady growth of American carrier strength and the equally steady decline of Japanese capabilities. He had seen the projections that showed how the war would end long before the fighting stopped. He had understood the mathematics of industrial production that made defeat inevitable once the Americans mobilized their full capacity. In the years after the war, Nakamura was interviewed by American occupation authorities who were documenting Japanese intelligence capabilities. They asked him directly when he knew that Japan had lost the war. His answer was simple and precise. November 1943, when reconnaissance photographs showed 11 American carriers operating together in a single task force, and he realized that every estimate of American industrial capacity had been catastrophically wrong. By November 1943, the Americans had commissioned 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, with another 7 under construction and more being laid down every month. Japan had commissioned 1 fleet carrier, Taiho, which wouldn't even be ready for operations until March 1944. The ratio was already insurmountable. Everything that happened after November 1943 was simply the working out of industrial and mathematical realities that had become fixed and unchangeable. The question that haunted Japanese naval intelligence after the war was how they had gotten it so wrong. The analysts weren't incompetent. They weren't ignoring evidence. They were working with reasonable assumptions based on historical precedent and careful observation of American pre-war shipbuilding practices. They assumed that American carrier construction would follow the patterns established during peacetime. Careful work, skilled craftsmen, construction timelines measured in years. They projected that assumption forward and concluded that American carrier production would be constrained by the same limitations that constrained Japanese production: specialized shipyards, limited numbers of workers with the necessary skills, complex vessels that required time to build properly. What they failed to understand was that the Americans had thrown out every rule about how ships were supposed to be built. Henry Kaiser, the construction engineer who had never built a ship before 1941, revolutionized shipbuilding by treating vessels like large-scale construction projects rather than specialized craft work. Prefabricate components in factories, standardize everything, use welding instead of riveting, train workers to do one specific task repeatedly rather than expecting them to master traditional shipbuilding skills, build ships in sections that could be assembled quickly rather than constructing from the keel up one piece at a time. Newport News Shipbuilding, the lead yard for the Essex-class program, learned from Kaiser's methods and applied them to fleet carrier construction. They built entire sections of carriers in specialized shops, then moved complete assemblies to the shipway for final integration. Flight deck sections built in one building, elevator assemblies constructed and tested in another, propulsion modules pre-assembled and test-fired before installation. Everything standardized so that workers needed minimal training to complete their assigned tasks. The result was carriers that went from keel laying to commissioning in 14 to 16 months. Not 3 years, not 4 years, 14 months. Japan couldn't match that timeline because Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure for true mass production. Japanese industry emphasized craftsmanship and quality. American industry emphasized volume and speed. Both approaches had merit. But in wartime, speed won. Japanese intelligence officers, after the war, admitted that they had been victims of mirror imaging. They had looked at American shipbuilding through Japanese eyes and assumed that American constraints would mirror Japanese constraints. They had assumed that American values about craftsmanship and quality would match Japanese values. They had projected their own limitations onto an enemy who operated under completely different assumptions about how to mobilize industrial capacity for war production. The failure was analytical rather than empirical. The raw data about American industrial capacity was available. American steel production, American shipyard expansion, American workforce mobilization, all of it was documented in open sources that Japanese intelligence could access. But having data is not the same as understanding what it means. Japanese analysts looked at the numbers and interpreted them through a framework that assumed American industrial mobilization would follow patterns similar to Japanese mobilization. The framework was wrong, and that error made accurate assessment impossible, even when the data itself was accurate. By 1944, when the extent of American carrier production became undeniable, it was too late to adjust Japanese strategy in any meaningful way. The ships were already built, the pilots were already trained, the industrial system was already producing carriers faster than combat could sink them. Japan couldn't build enough carriers to compete. Japan couldn't train enough pilots to match American numbers. Japan couldn't win a war of attrition when the attrition ratio favored America by factors of 10 to 1 or more. The final ratio tells the story completely. Japan built 6 fleet carriers during the war. America built 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, plus 77 Casablanca-class escort carriers, plus dozens of other escort carrier types. The total American carrier production exceeded 110 ships commissioned during the war, 110 carriers to Japan's 6. The ratio was roughly 18 to 1. But even that understates the actual gap, because American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, had better radar, better damage control, better everything. An Essex-class carrier with 90 aircraft and comprehensive radar coverage represented far more combat power than a Japanese carrier with 65 aircraft and limited radar. So the 18 to 1 numerical advantage translated to something closer to 30 to 1 in actual combat capability. That level of superiority made naval combat one-sided. Japanese surface forces couldn't operate within range of American carriers without being destroyed. Japanese supply lines couldn't function within range of American carriers without being severed. Japanese defensive positions couldn't hold within range of American carriers without being neutralized through overwhelming air attack. The Pacific War became a war of American carrier aviation, systematically destroying Japan's capacity to resist, while Japanese forces watched helplessly from defensive positions that shrank daily. The war ended not because the atomic bombs provided a decisive technological advantage, though they certainly contributed to Japanese leadership's decision to surrender. The war ended because Japan had no military capacity remaining to resist invasion, and that capacity had been destroyed primarily by carrier aviation, operating from ships that American shipyards had mass-produced using techniques that Japanese intelligence had never imagined were possible. The lesson from the carrier construction race extends far beyond World War II. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Japan had better carrier doctrine in 1941, better pilots, better aircraft, better operational experience. They won every battle for the first 6 months of the war, but tactical advantages erode, pilots die, aircraft become obsolete, doctrine evolves, industrial advantages compound. Every new carrier America built made it easier to build the next one. Every trained worker made training the next worker faster. Every standardized component made the supply chain more efficient. By mid-1943, American carrier construction had become a self-reinforcing system. Shipyards were completing carriers faster than the Navy could train full crews for them. Japan never achieved that momentum. Every carrier they built consumed resources needed for the next one. Every worker trained took time away from production. Every component had to be custom fitted because Japanese industry lacked the infrastructure for true standardization. The gap widened exponentially, not linearly, and that exponential divergence determined the outcome of the Pacific War before most of the major battles were fought. The title says the Japanese counted 11 U.S. carriers in 1943, then America launched 17 more in 18 months. That's accurate. In November 1943, American carrier strength in the Pacific was approximately 11 fleet and light carriers operational. By May 1945, 18 months later, another 17 Essex and Independence-class carriers had been commissioned and deployed. The number seemed impossible to Japanese intelligence officers who were still operating under assumptions about carrier construction timelines that had been rendered obsolete by American industrial methods they hadn't understood until it was far too late to matter. Wars are won in factories long before they are decided on battlefields. The Japanese understood what was happening by late 1943, but understanding the problem and solving it were entirely different things. Japan couldn't build more shipyards because they lacked the steel, the machine tools, the workers, and the logistics infrastructure. Japan couldn't train more pilots because they lacked the fuel, the instructors, and the time. Japan couldn't increase steel production because they lacked the coal, the iron ore, and the merchant shipping to transport raw materials. Every aspect of Japanese industrial capacity was constrained by resources that were running out. Every aspect of American industrial capacity was expanding. By 1945, American shipyards were launching carriers they didn't strictly need. Some Essex-class carriers were completed after the war ended. They never fired a shot in combat, but they existed, demonstrating that American production capacity exceeded even the enormous demands of a two-ocean war fought simultaneously against Germany and Japan. The gap between American capacity and Japanese capacity wasn't small. It was absolute. The Pacific War was decided in shipyards, not battles. Battles determined when the war ended and how many people died before the inevitable conclusion. Shipyards determined who would win. And the American shipyards, with their pre-fabrication techniques, their welding innovations, their standardized designs, their armies of workers who had never built ships before the war started, crushed Japan's naval power through sheer industrial output measured in dozens of carriers, where Japan could produce only handfuls. The final image that captures the entire story is simple. In July 1945, Task Force 38 operated off Japan with 17 fleet carriers, 17 carriers in one task force, more carriers than Japan had possessed in its entire navy at the height of Japanese power, more carriers than Japan could build in a decade of peacetime construction, more carriers than most people in Japanese naval intelligence had thought possible for any nation to deploy simultaneously. Those 17 carriers and the 6 light carriers supporting them, and the dozens of escort carriers operating in secondary roles, and the 20 or 30 more carriers under construction in American shipyards that would be completed over the following months, represented the answer to the question Japanese intelligence had been asking since November 1943. How did they do it? They did it by treating shipbuilding as an industrial process rather than a craft tradition. They did it by mobilizing resources at scales Japan couldn't match. They did it by training hundreds of thousands of workers to do specialized tasks rather than relying on small numbers of master craftsmen. They did it by standardizing everything so that components built in Pennsylvania could be installed in ships being assembled in Virginia without modification. They did it by building so many carriers that losing 1 or 2 in the combat barely registered as a strategic setback. And they did it because no one in Japanese naval intelligence had understood until far too late that the Americans were capable of industrial mobilization at scales that violated every assumption Japanese planners had made about how wars were fought and won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.